It had been a day of driving. Katie found out that if you count them, there are a lot of blue cars on the highway. Orbie learned that drawing in the car makes a lot of jiggly lines, and they both discovered that if you sing, the time seems to go faster. It wasn't long before Katie and her family arrived at the campground. Mom got out of the car, kicked off her shoes, and hurried over to the water. She called to the others to come and dip their toes in the gorgeous lake before they unpacked. Katie took her shoes off, and so did Dad, and they all splashed a silly little "We're finally here" water dance, kicking the water high up in the air. As they stood laughing in the lake, Orbie felt something wiggly touching his toes, and he tweebled and shot right out of the water. The little sunfish in the water below was even more startled than Orbie. Orbie zipped up to the car before Dad could call his name, and Dad ran to him and explained that a little sunfish had mistaken his pink toes for delicious worms. The fish didn't mean to hurt him. Orbie crept back and looked in the water. Cute little fish swam all around. Orbie smiled and dipped his hand in. One especially brave fish swam over and checked out his pink fingers. It nudged Orbie's hand with its nose and then swam away. Katie and Orbie giggled at it. Orbie wasn't scared anymore. He knew the fish had decided that Orbie fingers didn't taste nearly as good as worms. After they set up the tent and eaten a delicious lunch, Dad told them it was time to go searching for wild things. Everybody put on their life jackets. Dad held the canoe steady while Mom got in at the front. Dad pushed it into the water a little further, and Katie and Orbie climbed into the middle and sat down. Canoes could be very wobbly if you don't sit down. Dad stepped into the water and pushed the canoe off the shore. They were floating out into the lake. The canoe wobbled as Dad stepped in, but it settled down as they started to paddle. Dad told the two friends that a canoe was so silent that they could paddle close to nature and not disturb it. He said Katie and Orbie had special jobs in the canoe to be the nature hunters. When they saw something, they were to whisper for the others to see it too. Orbie was trying really hard to see something special. He strained and squinted and made binoculars with his hand. Katie wanted to laugh, but she managed not to. All at once, Orbie noticed a group of rocks sticking out of the water. On the rock was a large, fat bird with a weird neck. Katie whispered that it looked like a great big blue heron she saw once. But Dad said this bird was actually called a turkey vulture. Behind the vulture, something moved in the woods. It was a little red fox. He stood and looked at the canoe as they floated by. The friends thought he looked beautiful. As they paddled along, Katie spotted what looked like a field of lily pads with beautiful yellow flowers. Dad said it was a floating field. She wanted to pick some of the flowers, but Mom explained that it took the lily a long time to grow a flower. It was best to leave them where they were. All kinds of insects and creatures needed the flowers to live on. Further down the lake, Orbie noticed some bushes moving, and he whispered a little Orbie sound, and the paddlers stopped paddling. Everyone waited to see what it might be. Then something brown flashed through the trees, disappeared, and then stepped right out into the clearing. It was a deer. The deer cautiously approached the water and took a sip. Everybody in the canoe was delighted. They stayed as quiet as they could, and they watched until the deer took a big, graceful jump and bounded back into the woods. The nature hunters and their helpful paddlers headed back to camp, where they had a wonderful rest of the day. They cooked their lunch over the campfire and roasted marshmallows. As they snuggled down in their sleeping bags, Katie wondered if some of nature's wild things weren't watching them. Dad imagined some were, and he was sure they'd appreciate how respectful Katie and Orbie were of their hidden places. The two nature-hunting friends were soon asleep. Later that night, after even Mom and Dad were sound asleep, something quite eerie woke Katie. It sounded like someone was crying or calling. Katie sat right up. She wanted to go right outside and help, but she knew A child never left a tent at night without a parent. So Katie tapped Dad's shoulder. The eerie sound came again at that very moment, and Katie whispered to Dad that one of nature's animals was in trouble. When Dad heard the noise, he knew what it was. He took Katie's hand and ever so quietly led her outside the tent. It was very dark, but a great big moon hung like a silver spotlight in the sky. Dad looked for a moment and then saw what was making the sound. He walked Katie right to the shore and pointed out along the moonlight's path. There, in the silver light, floating on the lake, was a loon. The loon threw his head back and made the noise again, and Katie smiled. She felt better that it was only a loon, but as she looked, she told Dad that she thought the loon sounded lonely. It must be crying in the night because it was all by itself. Dad put his arm around Katie and told her that he was pretty sure she was in for a surprise. He told her to watch a little longer. The loon called out again, and then, from somewhere else, came an answer. Katie was amazed to see another loon swim into the moonlight path. The loon wasn't lonely at all. Dad explained that he was calling for his mate, and that made Katie very happy. As Dad and Katie settled down in their sleeping bags again, Katie listened to the loons as they talked together. Their voices were like music, and she felt as if they were singing her a lullaby. Soon she was fast asleep. The next day, the nature hunters paddled right up to the family of loons in the lake. And they were amazed at how far and how fast they could swim underwater without coming up. That night, Orbie stayed up to hear the loon's lullaby in the moonlight. Katie and Orbie tried calling back to them, and Katie was sure that she heard them answering. And I'm pretty sure if you had been sitting on the moonlit beach with the friends, you'd have heard them answer too.